Thanks, Carrie. And as we start, let me say that if you'd like to learn more about Sensible Financial, just check out our website, www.sensiblefinancial.com. And I'll repeat what Carrie encouraged you to do. If you have questions, please put them in the chat window at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for joining us, and let's begin. And I guess just a quick reminder that there will be 2 additional webinars in this series. The first one will talk about Social Security and how that would influence your retirement plan. That will be next week. And finally, Am I on Track to Retire, including the impact of life expectancy, and that will be the 1st of December. And we'll send reminders and links for these webinars if you haven't already registered. In this series, we are looking at being ready for retirement. And in the last webinar, we talked about how you have an implicit retirement plan and that you can retire once your assets will fund post-retirement spending. Today, we're going to put a little bit more meat on the bones of the assets that you need to fund post-retirement spending and talk about how to calculate those assets, which we'll call your number. Then later in the series, we'll talk about how longer lifespans require later retirement, lower spending, or both. And we'll talk about how claiming Social Security benefits at 70 often leads, but not always, but often leads to the earliest possible retirement. So let's get to today's topic. What's my number? And the number is a concept that was made famous, I think, by Lee Eisenberg, who wrote a book entitled The Number, which was published in 2006. And he was referring to, when he said number, he was referring to net worth and how much you would need to retire on. And the book was very popular. It's still available on Amazon, and it earned a place on a number of bestseller lists, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and it's been published internationally. So it might be worth it to check it out. It's not just about asset accumulation, despite the title. Eisenberg emphasizes thinking through all of your retirement priorities, not just financial priorities. So, what's my number? And despite the suggestion of the title, there isn't just one number. Each year you might want to retire has its own number. And the assets you retire with must cover your whole retirement from that point forward. Retiring earlier requires you to spread your assets over more years. And as you might think, if you want the same level of retirement spending, you'll need more assets for more years of retirement. If you were with us last week, you remember Tina and Steve Yall. We met them, and let's get reacquainted. I set their earnings and their earnings history at fixed percentages of the Social Security's wage base. And that is the maximum earnings level that the FICA taxes are paid on, and the maximum earnings on which your Social Security benefits are calculated. So far, Tina and Steve have accumulated nearly $500,000 in assets. And their discretionary spending, their spending above and beyond what they're committed to spend, is as much as they can afford, and they're spending $38,000 a year in that area. In addition to that, they have to pay rent and they have to pay taxes. And the taxes aren't shown, but they're spending $30,000 a year on rent. They're planning as if they'll live to be 100, and we'll talk about why that's important next week. And they plan to start Social Security benefits at their age 70. Let's also recall the economic assumptions that we're using. The taxes that they pay and the Social Security that they will earn are based on the current US systems. We've made assumptions about how Congress will resolve the coming shortfall of Social Security taxes to fund Social Security benefits. We've said that the additional funding will be provided half by benefit reduction and half by tax increases, and that implies a benefit reduction of about 11%. And we've also made inflation and interest rate assumptions. Real interest rates are very low. We've assumed about 60 basis points, about 0.5%. And inflation, we're forecasting at about 2%. And at Sensible Financial, we adjust those every year in January. So these are the numbers that we calculated at the beginning of this year. Last week, we asked, when can the Yalls retire? We looked at several different dates at which they might retire together. And this week, we're going to look at each scenario from two perspectives. We're going to look at them for when they can retire, and we're also going to look at what they would need in order to retire at each of the retirement ages, 55, 60, 65, and 70. And in other words, we're going to look at the number at each of those ages. If you were with us last week, you saw that for each scenario, we could calculate how much they could afford to spend if they retired at 55, at 60, 65, and 70. And if they retired very early, they could spend about $15,000 a year. And they're currently spending about $38,000 a year. So that would be a rather disappointing retirement. If they retire at 60, they could afford to spend $27,000 a year, closer to what they're currently spending, but not there. Retiring at 65 would allow them to retire and spend about what they're spending now, $38,000 a year. And finally, if they retire at 70, they could spend more. Suppose, though, that they didn't listen to us and they said they were going to retire now anyway, and they just make it work. That would not be a good idea. If they retired now and kept spending at $38,000 a year, they would run through their non-retirement assets at about 59, and they'd use up their retirement assets by 63. They would be completely out of funds, and they would be in deep trouble. If they didn't do anything at all, if they could figure out somehow how to get from 63 to 70 when they're planning to draw their Social Security benefits, then they would start to draw their Social Security benefits, but they'd have to get somebody to finance this, and that somebody would have to come up with more than $1 million to allow them to spend $38,000 a year and rent at $30,000 a year, as they're doing now. In real life, what they'd do is they'd start their Social Security benefits at 62 or 63, and then they'd limp along. They'd have to reduce their rent a lot. They'd cut discretionary spending to the bone. It would not be fun. On the other hand, if they retire at 65, everything works perfectly. You'll notice that their assets would grow from where they are now at 55 up to about $800,000 in assets by age 65. And then their assets would drop pretty quickly until 70 when Social Security starts, at which point they would start to slow, or the rate of decline would slow, and they'd have enough assets until age 100. And that is a well-planned and well-carried-out retirement. And there's much less drama in this scenario than there would be if they retired at 55. Drama is not something that we're looking for, by the way, when we're planning for retirement. At least I'm not. I hope you're not either. Now let's look at the assets that the Yalls would have at each age if they plan to retire at that age, and if they plan to spend what they could afford. So remember, if they retired at 55, they could spend $15,000 a year. And if they retire, and at 55, at the end of this year, 2020, they would have about $520,000 in assets. At the end of the year they turn 60, they'd have about $730,000 in assets. $520,000 in assets would sustain spending of $15,000 a year. $730,000 in assets would sustain spending of $27,000 a year, starting at age 60. $820,000 in assets would sustain spending of $38,000 a year, starting at 65. And if they retire at 70, they'd have a little bit less in assets, $808,000, but they'd be able to spend more because they're starting later. And in fact, they'd be able to spend $48,000 a year. Now, looking at this set of assets for each age, only the total at 65 is really their number. That's the number, that's the amount of assets that they would need to retire at 65 and spend $38,000 a year. These amounts of assets at 55 and 60 are too low to be their number. And this amount of assets, 808,000, is too high. It's more than they would need to have at age 70 if they wanted to spend $38,000 a year. So let's look and see what those other numbers are. At 55, the number is $1,440,000. It's almost, or in fact, it's a little more than $900,000 higher than the assets that they would have if they just proceeded blithely, or rather, if they plan to retire at 55 and spend $15,000 a year. They'd need $920,000 more to retire at 55 and spend $38,000 a year. And that's the right number. Now, you might ask, well, where are they going to get the extra money? And the answer is, my answer is, I don't know. Maybe they have a rich uncle, or they're very fortunate at Powerball. But the number to spend $38,000 from 55 through age 100 is $1.4 million. They have 520. The number at 60 is $1.1 million, and they have 730. So they're about $400,000 short here. The number at age 65 is 820, which is what they have. And at 70, the number is only 500,000 because they have to cover spending only from 70 through age 100. So notice that as we move from 55 to 60 to 65 to 70, the numbers decline. They decline pretty smoothly. Now, I like to have intuition about this. I like to have a sense of whether the numbers make sense. So remember that they need $312,000 less at 70 to spend $38,000 than the $48,000 they could spend if they had $808,000. So how does that work? If they were going, here's the extra money they have the $312,000, and they're going to have 30 years in retirement from age 70 to 100. So the extra assets per year, if we divide the $312,000 by 30, we get $10,400. Now let's look at the difference in discretionary spending. If they work till 70, they can spend $48,600. The number at 70, or the spending, if they start with the number, is $38,300. The extra spending per year is $10,300. These numbers are really close. So it makes sense. If they're going to spend $10,300 less, then they need about $312,000 less. That's 30 times the difference. Another way to think about the number is to calculate from the bottom up. Think about that number at age 70. Let's add up the average annual spending from ages 70 to 100. So we add up the discretionary spending, the housing, the income taxes, and we're going to average those across all the years. Medicare Part B premiums, and again, we're going to average those across all of the years, and we get $79,100. Now, in addition to their assets, Steve and Tina have Social Security benefits. And those Social Security benefits are very substantial. Steve will have $23,900 a year. Tina will have $37,600 a year for a total of $61,500. So the difference between what they're going to spend, $79,100, and the amount they'll have from Social Security, $61,500, is $17,600. We're going to call that, I'm going to call that the Social Security gap. Now, let's add up what they're going to be able to draw from their portfolio and the income they'll have on that portfolio. For the non-retirement assets, for the assets outside the retirement accounts, they'll average about $600 a year in income. They'll draw about $2,500 a year. And then from their retirement accounts, Steve will withdraw almost $5,000 and Tina almost $10,000. If we add those numbers up, we get 17,600. Those numbers are the same. So the number is just enough to fill that Social Security gap. Let's look at that in a picture. So here is what Steve and Tina will spend, $79,100, and here's their Social Security income, $61,500. So there's the Social Security income, and their number at age 70 is just enough to fill that gap. If they want to retire at 65, they need all of this, plus they have to fill this. So the number at 65 contains both of those components. And if they want to retire at 55, then they have to fill this gap as well. And there, graphically, you see why the number at 55 is larger than the number at 65, which is larger than the number at 70. And I think we're ready to take questions.
Okay, well, we do have a couple questions already. And as I mentioned before, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You click on it and just type right in there. First question's from Janet. She said she read the 2021 Medicare IRMAA threshold for married filing jointly is under $176,000. I understand the 2-year look back. Can this threshold go down lower than that $176,000 threshold?
Can it go down lower? I'm not sure exactly what Janet is asking. The threshold is set by the Medicare administration every year. And I think in general, we would expect it to increase. We would expect it to increase with inflation. I suppose if we had deflation, it could decrease. But my understanding is that those thresholds increase with inflation.
Okay. Another attendee asks, what software are you using for planning, and how effective do you think the software is in helping you make these plans?
We use Maxify, which is a piece of software that was developed by Larry Kotlikoff, who is a professor of economics at Boston University and also an expert in Social Security. It is excellent software. It works very well for the way we plan. I'd be happy to expand on that. I gave a webinar, I gave a version of this webinar or this series of webinars on the for Maxify, and a copy of it is on our website and also on Maxify's website. And if you have specific questions about Maxify, please feel free to send me an email. And I think my email address is on the last page of this presentation.
Okay, there are a couple of questions that pertain specifically to the presentation. Maggie asks, why would the Yalls have fewer assets at age 70?
Oh, sorry, went the wrong way. So she's asking this about why the 496,000 is less than 808,000. Okay, if we go back and we look at this chart, these numbers, these levels of assets are the assets that the Yalls would need to spend the affordable level of spending if they, let's see how to explain this. I'm sorry. Let me go back here for a second. Okay. Remember, let's start with this chart. If they retired now, they could afford to spend $15,000 a year, and that $15,000 is linked to, or is the amount that's afforded by this $519,000 in assets. If we know that they're going to retire at 60, then they're going to have earned more assets in their lifetime. And they'll be able to spend $27,000 a year, and they will have accumulated $730,000 in assets. But that's not enough to allow them to spend $38,000 a year. If they plan to retire at 65, then they'll have earned even more money. They'll have been able to save more, and they'll then be able to spend $38,000. If they plan to retire at 70, they'll have earned even more in their lifetime, and they'll be able to spend this $48,000 or $49,000 and have enough assets starting at 70 to spend $48,000 or $49,000 from that point forward. So the $808,000 is enough from age 70 on, is enough to support $48,000 or $49,000. If they want to spend only $38,000, which is what they're spending now, then they can do it with less assets. They don't need as many assets to spend less money as they need to spend more money. They don't need as many assets to spend $38,000. They need this. I got to go this way. They only need $500,000 to spend $38,000. They need $800,000 to spend $49,000. And that was the point of this, right? That they're going to spend, if they're going to spend only $38,000, then they need $10,000 a year less, and that $10,000 a year less times 30 is $300,000. That's the amount less that they need.
Okay. Another attendee asks about the last chart in the presentation. I believe that might be the build chart.
Yes, this one.
He or she says that they're having trouble understanding how this works exactly.
Okay, so let's try perhaps a little bit different way. So they want to spend in total $79,000 a year. They have in Social Security income $61,500 a year. So each year they are short by $17,600. That $17,600 has to come from somewhere. And I'm suggesting that it comes from the assets that they've saved. And if we add up that $17,600 every year for 30 years, then we get the number at age 70, which we said was about a little less than $500,000, right? And if you multiply 30 times 17,000, you get 510,000. So that gives you a sense of how that number is calculated. The number they need is a little less because they're going to earn interest on the number they start with. Okay, let's hope that clarified.
Okay. Okay, what is the philosophy with waiting until age 70 to start taking your Social Security benefits? Why not take it at 66 and a half?
We'll talk next week about that philosophy and why that works. I think a short way to answer the question is that each year you wait from 66 to 70 or from 67 to 70 to take your Social Security benefits adds 8% to that benefit for every year of your life. So you can think about that as equivalent to buying an annuity with an 8% payout rate. And it's a real annuity. It's an annuity that where the payout increases to match inflation. If you go to the market today and say, I want to buy an annuity at age 70, you can buy an annuity with a payout rate of 5.5% or 6%, and it's not inflation adjusted. So that it's just it, and I think you can no longer buy inflation-adjusted annuities, but if you could, you'd be getting a payout rate of 4.5%. It's just an extraordinary offer that the Social Security Administration, the federal government, is making to you. And if your health is good, it's a very wise decision to accept the offer that they're making.
Okay. I think we have one more question. Okay. And this is an interesting question. Actually, they're all pretty interesting, but do all the scenarios work out to having $0 left at age 100 using that smooth spending scenario?
All of the scenarios are designed to, or the number is calculated so that, and each plan is calculated so that financial assets will be exhausted at age 100. And so we're planning for people to live to be 100. And we'll talk more about why we do that in the last webinar.
Okay. Well, there are more questions, but some of them will be answered in some of the upcoming webinars, and others we will keep, and we can get with you individually to answer it. Meanwhile, thank you very much for attending today. And don't forget, there are 2 more webinars left in this series. Next week is what's the impact of Social Security on my retirement? Next week, it's November 24th at 2 p.m. also a Tuesday. And then the 4th in this series is Am I on Track to Retire? That'll be December 1st, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much for attending.
Thank you.